Welcome to People and Profit, where we look at how business shapes our world. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up, then there were two. We compare Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron's plans for the French economy and ask if their promises are realistic. Beware of the zombies, how cheap credit is keeping failing companies in business. And we meet the woman helping revive Nigeria's cocoa industry with chocolate especially made for the local market. First up, though, we now have our two finalists for the French presidency. Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron have contrasting visions of how to manage the French economy. They do agree that things need to change to tackle issues like high unemployment, but their remedies are vastly different. Well, for more on this story, I'm joined from Washington by the economist Nicolas Véron. He co-founded the Bruegel think tank and is a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Nicolas Véron, thank you for joining us. If we start looking with Emmanuel Macron's programme, first of all, he's promising 20 billion euros worth of cuts. Cuts for workers, cuts for businesses, cuts for homeowners. Is this a good plan? Is this going to help the French economy?
Yeah, because there is also, on top of that, an overly cautious fiscal stance. So this is not reckless tax spending. And the cuts are targeted at taxes that are inefficient and unfair to a large extent. For example, a residency tax, which is often disconnected with the values of the properties because it has been set up a long time ago and is difficult to update. So it's a sort of no-nonsense approach to tax policy. Should be mildly stimulative, but not rocking the boat.
OK, on unemployment, Emmanuel Macron wants to invest massively in training, and he also wants rules like the 35-hour working week to be made more flexible. Do you think that will help to create jobs and cut unemployment?
I think in terms of domestic economic policies, this is really the main emphasis of the Macron candidacy. And it's also what he has done in the past, right? What economists call structural reform. Talking about the structures of the economy, training, lifelong training is a big thing because it's a mess in France right now. Very poor governance, lots of waste. So he's really seeking a mandate to reform that, reforming the pension system. So all these reforming labor market regulation, which is very onerous in France, in some aspects protective, but in some aspects creating unnecessary obstacles for business. So that's where he has credibility because he has done a lot of that when he was economy minister, and that's also where there are most expectations, I think, from the investor community in terms of having chance that would put the French economy on a better direction.
You mentioned earlier this idea of fiscal balance and being sensible in where you're cutting your revenues. And Emmanuel Macron also wants to cut a lot from public spending. This is following in the vein from what we saw under François Hollande. Do you think it's achievable, his target of 60 billion more in savings on public spending?
Yeah, it's actually a reasonable target. It's not reckless. It's less than what was envisaged by the centre-right candidate, François Fillon, who didn't make it to the second round. So it's, I wouldn't say it's middle of the road, but I think it's a reasonably cautious, realistic approach. And I don't think there are any sharp edges there. There is a potential for expenditure cutting in the French state. As you know, there is a very large proportion of GDP that goes into taxes and public spending. So I don't see anything that would be disturbing in that space.
You're saying a lot of positive things about what we're hearing out of Emmanuel Macron's programme. Is there anything in there that you would be critical of in terms of his economic policy?
Not really. Again, the word that comes to mind is no nonsense. It's a sort of cautious, realistic approach with some ambition on structural reform, especially on training and pension reform. Lots of things to like if you are in sort of mainstream economic thinking. Some people would say it's not very radical, but I think what's radical in the candidacy is more on the political side, the realignment of the party landscape. And this is where Macron has represented the most surprise.
If we turn then to Marine Le Pen, on taxes, her plan is very much focused on the low-income workers. She wants to cut taxes by 10% for them on the income side. She also wants to impose a tax on imports. What's your assessment of the taxation part of her programme?
Well, obviously, the most salient policy, economic policy of Marine Le Pen is her rhetoric about leaving the euro, and it's been very, going back and forth in different directions. It's not clear what exactly her plan is, what her timetable is, but leaving the euro would be immensely disruptive for France, and that's certainly the number one item, and everything comes after that. Now, in terms of her tax plans, it's not very clear how they can add up. And I think the question of the overall balance, I mean, you can say that of Macron as well, in a way you can say that of any candidate, but the gap between the expenditures, the reduction of the tax burden, and the sustainability of the fiscal stance is much greater in the case of Le Pen than it is in the case of Macron.
Would you say there's any upside to her plans of wanting to leave the euro? Is there anything that could be good for France's economy out of that?
Not from where I sit. I think it would be an unmitigated disaster, and I actually believe it won't happen, even assuming she would get elected. But she has been talking a lot about it, and this is not good for the investment climate.
When you look at the goals the candidates have laid out for things like economic growth and unemployment, Emmanuel Macron, for example, is saying that he wants to cut unemployment to 7% by 2022. Do you see that as being realistic?
It's not entirely unrealistic. It's certainly ambitious, but at this point, what you've seen in the last 18 months or so is French unemployment getting stuck, completely stable at the same high level, while unemployment is decreasing actually quite rapidly in the rest of the eurozone. So I would say it's not implausible to believe that France would catch up with the rest of the eurozone. Unemployment has gotten down very rapidly, for example, in Spain, admittedly from a very high level. At this point, France is a bit of an outlier in terms of having unemployment staying high and at a stable level. So I think there is catch-up potential here.
When you look at economic growth as well, Marine Le Pen says she's expecting 2.1% growth next year. Emmanuel Macron, 1.7%. Do you see much of a discrepancy in those figures? Are both kind of within a reasonable range?
No, I think both of them are reasonable. The question is whether their intended policies would deliver that. But I think having, as the ECB would put it, French growth close but below 2% is not implausible.
OK, Nicolas Véron from the Peterson Institute in Washington, thank you very much for speaking to us. Now, turning next to Japan, where the corporate sector scored an unusual record in the past year. In the 12 months until the end of March, no publicly listed Japanese company went bankrupt. That's the first time that's happened in 26 years. The firm Tokyo Shoko Research says the change is down to lower interest rates and a weaker yen. But there are fears too that Japan, like other developed economies, is seeing a rise of the so-called zombie company. William Hildebrandt's here to explain. Will, this sounds terrifying.
It's frightening, but it's a reality, Stephen. A zombie company is one that in a competitive economy would have died off, but due to various circumstances manages to limp along, hogging valuable resources. The OECD defines it as a company that is at least 10 years old, settled with so much debt it is difficult just to pay the interest, and it also has slowing productivity. Its weak performance can have a drag on the wider economy, and just like in the cinema, zombies are an international phenomenon on the rise. Beijing's Renmin University says that 10% of publicly traded companies in China were zombies, including more than half of the steel sector. And there were 0 bankruptcies of publicly traded companies last year in Japan. Meanwhile, an OECD report said that there has been a 3.5% rise in the share of zombie firms across 9 of its member countries, ranging from Europe to Asia. So what is the threat? Well, since zombies are struggling with debt, that's also risky for their lenders and governments who may, in the end, have to extend a bailout. Their existence causes both an excess in competition, which puts downward pressure on prices, and congestion. And by eating up valuable resources, they prevent younger, healthier firms from entering the market. So how to survive a zombie threat? Well, it comes down to corporate discipline. When necessary, lenders and courts must force restructuring or liquidation. Central banks must adjust monetary policy, and that means cutting back on extremely cheap credit and ultra-low rates that are leftovers from the global financial crisis. Stephen?
Will, thank you very much. Sound advice for fighting zombies there. Now next, Nigeria may grow some of the world's finest cocoa, but the chocolate on its supermarket shelves is usually imported into the country, while the majority of its own produce is exported. One woman is trying to change that with a business making tasty treats aimed at a domestic market. Catherine Clifford has the story.
Hand grinding cocoa beans with a granite stone for a more authentic flavour. That's one of Ekwemi's secrets to her rich, dark product. She saw a gap in the market for locally made chocolates in Nigeria and seized on it, launching her business last year.
A lot of the things in the shops, they're not really chocolates. This is one time that I would say that the Nigerian product is of a more superior quality to whatever is being imported here. We do have trees that are 120 years old, producing some of the best chocolates one could ever find in the world. And we've been sitting on that.
Nigeria's cocoa production has plummeted from over 200,000 tonnes a year back in 1986, when the sector was deregulated, to less than 20,000 tonnes today. But it's still currently the world's fourth largest producer, though the majority is exported. Ekwemi sources her beans from Eti-Oni in southwestern Nigeria, the country's oldest cocoa community. Over the years, farmers here moved away from the sector due to a lack of infrastructure and support. Ekwemi created the Eti-Oni Development Group, which encourages local farmers to turn back to their traditional crop and teaches them to make chocolates from their own seeds.
There's a lot of middlemen participation along the buying chain. What we are trying to do now is to utilize our own cocoa for our own purpose, create another economy that will be able to use to fund our development initiatives.
Although Ekwemi's Eti-Oni chocolates haven't yet hit shop shelves in Nigeria, they're being bought by luxury hotels here